topic is where do we go from here, a debrief of the COP26 in Glasgow. I think I don't need to really explain why this is a very pertinent and timely topic, but I think it's still good to mention just a couple of things as an introduction before I welcome a number of excellent speakers, actually everyone having been in Glasgow, in and around Glasgow. So we will hear today firsthand what our colleagues have observed, what they felt, what they saw, what they heard, and ultimately also what they think Glasgow was, a success or a colossal failure. So is the glass half empty or is it half full? Because if we want to think about where we go from here, we should agree on where we are. So I'm really excited to do this. And before I hand over to our speakers, I just want to remind you of a couple of things. First of all, and that's really a coincidence, the COP26 this year is exactly halfway between 1992, when the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was actually signed, and the year 2050, by which we need to achieve net zero emissions. So in a way, this COP was a halfway point. So time to take stock as we do here today. So I think that also adds to the importance of this meeting. Now, also, I want to highlight that probably you would agree that when you read the press statements, the coverages in the media, that there were two narratives, two stories emerging. One was actually, well, that wasn't so bad, actually better than expected. States came up with some more ambitious pledges and proposals. There were all sorts of announcements made on very important topics, from forestry to cars and combustion engines and methane. And also states actually managed to close some of the last negotiations on the Paris rulebook. So all in all, actually a quite successful summit, if you compare it to, for example, the Madrid COP before, which was not that great. And then you have a second narrative, which is the narrative of blah, blah, blah. Basically, the idea that there was a lot of talk, but nothing to show really, because if you add up all the NDCs, so all the contributions by countries, and if you even throw in everything that companies, business wants to do, you still come up a bit short of 1.5 degrees. Actually, the latest count is if everything would be implemented to the letter, so if really everything that we plan actually works out, it will be 1.5 degrees. Now, these are really two different narratives. And I just want to remind you that the UK, which was the presidency of this COP, really marketed this meeting as a make or break point in the climate negotiations, because they said this is the moment in which we have to keep 1.5 degrees alive. And that's, of course, a really interesting framing. So was that achieved or not? We will hear from our speakers. I just want to, before I hand over, say that if you just look at the outcome of the summit, the so-called Glasgow Pact, I am actually inclined to believe it wasn't a big failure. It was probably a small success. For the first time, governments agreed on concrete reduction targets. There's a text in this agreement that says 45% reductions necessary compared to 2010 until the end of this decade, which is for the first time this ambition is in a UN document. There was also a clear commitment to 1.5 degrees, not to 2 degrees, but to 1.5 degrees. So this is really actually very, very important. Also, states are requested to come back next year, 2022, with more ambitious pledges. And indeed, the Article 6 of the rulebook for Paris has been concluded. So I'm inclined to say it wasn't a big failure, but maybe I've missed something. So I'm really happy to hear from our experts who have actually been in Glasgow, what went down and what happened. So first, I want to introduce Montserrat Koloffon. Montserrat is currently a PhD student at the VU. Montserrat does research on multi-stakeholder partnerships in relation to the SDGs, but she also is part of a consultancy project that is looking at one of the largest global philanthropic organizations that might not be named under any circumstances. It's totally confidential, so I can't tell you what that philanthropic organization is. But I know that you were in Glasgow to do interviews with many people. So I'm really happy to hear from you what you got as a feedback. And the question I'm really interested in is the glass half full? Is it half empty? And where would you go from here? Montserrat, the floor is yours. I'm very excited to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Philip, and hello, everyone. I would like to start by also thanking the Amsterdam Sustainability Institute for the invitation and for organizing this event to bring us together and reflect on the COP26, which, despite most of us here being colleagues at IVM, is something we actually haven't had the chance to do. So very happy to be here. Exactly, as Philip just mentioned, I'm currently doing a PhD focusing on how partnerships can help achieve the urgently needed transformational changes. But what actually brought me to the COP26 was this evaluation project we're working on. We're evaluating the international climate strategy of this big philanthropic foundation. And so for this evaluation, my job was to conduct interviews before, during, and after the COP to what we're calling people in positions of influence, which of course meant that I had the perfect excuse to approach people who would have otherwise been inaccessible to me and just invite them to share their perspectives and hear them firsthand. So obviously, we have a very reduced time, and I cannot go into much detail about what they said. But to summarize this in a bit of a chronological fashion, we could say that opinions pre-COP pointed to a cautious expectation. During the COP, they moved towards like a hopeful suspense, and post-COP, it's been a bit of what Philip was talking about, of this feeling of being pleased but frustrated at the same time. So yeah, I jotted down here, I have on my notes next to me a couple of phrases that came up from what these interviewees were saying, and I want to share some of them because I think this is kind of what you also have when you're at the COP and just walking through the halls or sitting at the cafeteria and hearing conversations next to you. You hear these comments. So I thought I would share some of that. So pre-COP, I heard, for example, that the idea of phasing out coal is completely utopian. That there is some momentum, but that there hasn't been a critical mass of, let's say, real life suffering for climate change to be even higher up the agenda. During the COP, comments were moved around hopes about, or hopes that the commitments would translate into actions, hopes for more nature-based solutions, hopes for socially just transitions, hopes that the funding that goes to the developing countries won't come with strings attached, and that developing countries will be self-sufficient. And yeah, I guess there was also a sense of like, okay, we are past climate denialist, and this is a thing, like denialism is moving to the margins. And post COP, so the interviews we've been conducting now, really, yeah, I think are in line to what Philip was saying in his introduction. So progress is great if we compare it to where we were just a few years ago, but not enough if we compare it to what science says is needed. And pleased with the results, but frustrated that still doesn't add up to what would be required. So some actually are mentioning that their expectations for the COP were actually met or even exceeded, but all of this in terms of relative success. So there was even some who said that what we're seeing is amazing, but it's coming quite late, and this should have come much earlier, but this is now where we're at. And this talk about shoulds isn't productive at all, so we shouldn't let it go down that road. So in view of the limited time, my personal impressions are that, well, from some media headlines or from some tweets, I read voices questioning that. So like basically like, what are we even doing in Glasgow? And the COPs are just where people go to preach on the to the converted, and this type of narrative. And for me, going to the COP for the first time was an experience of seeing in practice what I already knew in theory, which is that we've arrived to a point in which we have agreed on goals, but not yet on how to achieve them. There are many different voices, narratives, interests, and I think the value of the COPs is bringing all these together and try to bring us a little step forward. And we notice the progress when we look back, but it can be frustrated when we look ahead. And so I don't want to take a side of massive failure or massive success, but I do think it is important that we stay critical, and well, maybe we can discuss in the Q&A some other critical points of views that can be raised. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Montse. If you have any questions now, please put them in the chat. I was curious, so you were able to talk to all of that sort of important people. So how were you able to interact? How did that work in practice?
Yeah, it's funny. So we sent a lot of emails ahead, but didn't have too many confirmations yet. So not much was scheduled. And my first interview, I think, captures very well how I was fishing people. So I just sat down to grab a lunch, and next to me there was a woman sitting and also having lunch, and then the woman next to her started a conversation with her in English. Then they both realized they both spoke Portuguese, and I needed to interview people from Brazil. So after they finished their conversation, I asked them, hey, can I have an interview with you? I'm interviewing people from Brazil. And one of them was happy to take the interview. And this is really how things went the whole week.
Okay, so Vera is asking if you also had the chance to talk to a representative of indigenous communities.
No, well, I did not, but not because they weren't accessible, but rather because we had a very specific groups of people, or nationalities and actors that we were targeting, and that those didn't happen to be in our target group.
Cool. Yes, thank you. Is there any more questions for Montserrat? I think not now. So then, Philip.
Yes, thank you very much, Montserrat, for your first-hand assessment. I was really intrigued by you comparing what you heard before and after. For example, that people argue that phasing down or phasing out coal and the discussion on fossil fuels would be totally improbable. Nonetheless, we have for the first time a UN agreement on climate where the word coal is actually mentioned, and what we make of this is a second question, but I think this is a very important input. So thanks so much, and our next speaker will offer, I'm very sure, another important and interesting perspective. Cornelia Fast, she is also a colleague from the VU, doing also a PhD, but actually she was in Glasgow not on behalf of our university, but as part of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change's Secretariat, where she was helping out with identifying the non-state commitments that are an integral part of the Paris Agreement. So I'm really happy that you're here, Cornelia, and also really excited to hear what you learned from the perspective of someone working within the climate regime. So within really the hallways of where the negotiations take place, at least to some degree. So Cornelia, it's a great pleasure, and the floor is yours for your insights.
Thank you, Philip, and hello, everyone. My name is Cornelia Fast, and as Philip mentioned, I went to COP after having read about COP now for many years, studying it on paper, to see it in person with the UNFCCC Secretariat. And I joined I went there with the Communications and Engagement Division, that it's called. And they also look into the stakeholder engagement outreach. And I was in a small team called the Global Climate Action Team. So perhaps you have heard of a data platform called NASCA, or the Global Climate Action Platform, that has the job to track all the global commitments that are made by non-state and sub-state actors. And just so that everyone is clear on this terminology, that includes both cities and sub-regions, as well as companies, investors, and also civil society organizations, etc. So we went there with the intention to fulfill a mandate that was set out in the previous COP, which was asking the Global Climate Action Portal to not only list which actors that do something, but enhance this commitment by tracking their progress. So there's an aim here to create a more transparent process, and also to evaluate, are they actually taking credible climate action or not? So at COP, the UNFCCC Secretariat basically sets up a huge office there, and of course, this is a very different experience from, for example, being an observer, as Shauran and Montserrat was, where they could attend the different events, etc. But I would say that some of the key outcomes of this work, of course, we hosted some events to try to gather different stakeholders that work on this progress tracking efforts. And I would say on the whole, a great outcome was that we saw many successful examples from across the globe where non-state actors have taken extremely ambitious action compared to the state level, and they were not afraid to say it. For example, the mayor of London, the city of London, gave this example of their zero emission vehicle zone and things like that, and could really put it into perspective how tenfold many times that they have reduced their emissions compared to the nation as a whole. So it's not only from, for example, the youth movement that complaints are coming, but also from the actual cities that try to fulfill the national goals as well. And other than that, we also saw a huge engagement from the, let's say, data community. So it's a very niche outcome maybe, but for me it's super interesting as a researcher that used these big data portals and to understand what's going on. So we gathered both stakeholders from academia, but also, for example, Google and different institutes that collect data from new innovative methods. So for example, satellite data to track where the emissions come from and which actors that release them, etc. And there they could all agree that the efforts that have been made so far has really helped both parties and non-party stakeholders to understand what's going on and also help identify the gaps of where further action is needed. However, they also still had a critical discussion that for example, the global south and the small island states are still underrepresented in these data sets. And that also includes adaptation actions. So far, the Global Climate Action Portal, for example, and the Global Climate Action Agenda that feeds into has been very focused on mitigation actions. So this is something that in the coming years and that they are now pushing is to also integrate adaptation and also finance. So that's some of the outcomes I think that are really interesting. And also there was expression of a desire to create common methodologies and common terminologies to enhance this work even further. And so just to finish off now and connect back to the question of whether COP was successful or not, I would say that personally, I think COP was not a complete success because of the misrepresentation of certain communities. And also from a, let's say, day-to-day work, what I saw from the day-to-day work there was that, for example, the UNFCCC staff is perhaps a bit too much detached from everything that is going on at COP. For example, me personally could not go to so many events. So even though I produced a great product, hopefully that will feed into a larger discussion, I think it's a bit dangerous when people cannot attend COP and see different sides of it. And also, but on the positive side, I think I saw that people really dedicate 24 hours of their day almost without sleeping to work and to put these efforts. And it's really, it's easy to be critical, but then also in the end, I saw so much motivation and also a new spark being ignited by meeting in person and not online, for example, that people really try to make efforts. So I'm not trying to romanticize the story, but I think it's an important perspective to have, that it's humans working on this as well. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Cornelia. Again, your questions are welcome. So you said the Global South is being underrepresented both in the data, but also at the conference itself. About the data, how do you think this could be changed or could be improved?
So, I mean, for example, just one concrete example is that, the UNFCCC works with certain data partners, and the data these data partners send through, of course, unfortunately, that shows a misrepresentation already. So I think there's an important approach could be to really make a campaign or outreach to certain countries or areas where this data is lacking to really retrieve that. And that's something that then the people or stakeholders with the money and the capacity to do that needs to take that responsibility. Yeah.
Okay, then we have a question here. Which kind of meeting you didn't have access to?
Okay, so maybe I phrased it wrong, but it was more that I did not have time to attend many meetings. And I think that's the same for a lot of these staff members that, I personally think they should go to these meetings because it's to really get all the different inputs. So I probably had access to every single meeting compared to what an observer would have, but it was just, the capacity is not there to do it.
Yeah, any more questions in the chat or maybe also from the panel? Not for now. Okay, then I think maybe you can also elaborate a bit more on the cities and other stakeholders' role. So I think it's quite interesting, right? That other stakeholders are taking the initiative as well. Which stakeholders were all included in this? Because you were talking about non-state actors, right? So you said youth, you said cities. Who else is part of this group?
I mean, it's also companies and investors and banks, for example, so financial actors. I personally have a critical perspective to how far corporatism can take us further. But of course, you also see some prime examples, and so these groups are included in these success stories as well. Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Then I give the floor back to Philip.
Thank you also from my side, Cornelia, for these insights, and hope you have recovered from your sleeplessness in the meantime. So I think some of the things you said will carry through this debate. Very interestingly, again, different framings. Some people, and you have made examples, herald the involvement of non-state actors as a positive thing. But we also heard a lot about the problems around the fossil fuel lobby being very visible at the conference. So seem to be always these two sides, and something that needs critical discussion. Thank you, Cornelia, for your insights. And I will now move on to another perspective. I think one that has already been mentioned a couple of times, the perspective of smaller states, more vulnerable states, island states, those actors that are very much affected by climate change. And I'm very happy to welcome you, Sungkur. You are a student in our political science program at the VU. You have a bachelor from McGill University. You study now in Master Political Science, and you're from Mauritius. And you have been a youth delegate, a delegate in the UN Climate Change Youth Conference, and you attended this conference, which, if I'm not mistaken, was before Glasgow. So you've been at that conference, and this conference produced a statement that was actually a major input of the global youth movements to Glasgow. So I'm really happy that you're here, and you can tell us a bit if you think that there's still future for young people, and if your perspective you think has been sufficiently represented in the outcome of the summit. So youth, is the glass half full or half empty for someone representing youth, in particular from a very affected developing nation?
Thank you very much, Mr. Prasberg. Hello, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. I see a couple of students of my master's, so I'm very happy of this. So in those 5 little minutes, I wanted to talk about 2 aspects that are very close to my heart. So as Mr. Prasberg said, small island developing states and the youth perspectives on COP26. And from my view, in those 2 aspects, COP26 fell well below expectations. So it is often said that SIDS are considered victims of the climate crisis. And when you look at the numbers, I mean, you can easily say so. 75% of the global carbon emissions are emitted by the G20. And of the 25% left, SIDS, so basically around a population of 65 million people, they contribute to approximately 1% of those emissions. Yet, even though they emit so little, small island states are at the forefront of this crisis. I mean, sea level rise is becoming an urgent issue in the Marshall Islands, and cyclones are becoming more frequent and even more dangerous than ever in Mauritius. Those states are facing the harsh reality of the crisis, not in the future, but right now as we speak. So to me, why did the COP26 fall below expectations from a small island developing states? Well, after 2 years of preparations for this conference, a pandemic that shook the world, we had an alarm and even more promises from more leaders. We waited a lot for results at this COP. And to a certain extent, results were there. But what bothers me the most is how the results were made. So as Cornelia said, a big issue that I had with this COP is the lack of representation of the people from SIDS. I read an article about 2 weeks ago that said that only 3 Pacific leaders from Palau, Fiji, and Tuvalu out of 14 leaders made it to COP26 this year. And on the other hand, for example, the United States, they sent more than 1,000 people. This example, I think, just shows that during this conference, those on the front lines of the climate crisis have sadly been excluded, either through visa failures, lack of access of European vaccines, or constant changing travel rules. And as a result of this, COP26 culminated in a conference that overly represented the views of those who have contributed the most, yet the least to lose from the climate crisis. And this lack of representation, as you said, I have seen it with my own eyes because I had the chance to go to COI 16, so the Conference of Youth that happened just a weekend before COP26. And during this conference, what was funny is that I was super happy to go there and to actually meet all of their youth delegate from SIDS because I really wanted to talk with them and have their perspective. But I was super deceived to see that I was the only delegate from SIDS with only 2 other people from Maldives, and they had to pay more than 3,000 euros to come to Glasgow. So the conference I participated in, it regrouped the world's youth. More than 200 young minds were there in Glasgow, and they were basically from all over the world. It was a crazy experience to be in. The idea of this conference was to create a policy document crafted by the youth and to represent it and to show it during COP26. This document is called the Global Youth Statement. So it officially seeks to represent the voice of the youth and their policy demands to englobe every aspect of the climate crisis. We actually presented it to Alok Sharma, so the president of the COP26, Patricia Espinosa, and other world leaders during COP. The main demand that unifies all those themes, and the main super important one, was youth representation. During those conferences, we often talk about the future of our planet without really including the actual future of our planet, which is the youth, which to me is kind of absurd. The youth should be actively and meaningfully included in the decision-making processes, and it's not happening. So even though we're still pushing for it, our seat is not yet confirmed in those negotiations, and we're not genuinely taken seriously as we should. So personally, being from Mauritius and being still quite young, I can't say that I'm very happy with the results of COP26. And I would definitely say that the cup is half empty. We have all these beautiful speeches, those hopeful words from world leaders, those promises to, keep pushing for change and keep pushing for the better good. But at the same time, action is always taking so long, and it is taking an alarming amount of time. So yeah, I cannot see this glass half full, unfortunately. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Youth. That's quite a stark evaluation of the meeting. So you said, from your own country even, the representation at the COP was very little. Are you in touch, or do you have any link to them or to the people who went there? Or how it's been perceived in Mauritius itself, the results and the negotiations?
If I have links with who, sorry?
So do you know who's the delegation who went to Glasgow from Mauritius? Are you in touch with them? And then also, how it's been in Mauritius itself?
Unfortunately, I tried to make contact with them. It failed, unfortunately. I know that Mauritius, they sent 14 delegates to the COP, and they were basically the Prime Minister and other ministers. So it was a very close delegation. I tried to contact them, but it didn't happen.
And then, yeah, so, and do you know how it's been perceived in Mauritius itself, if people follow it, or if it's been a discussion in civil society maybe?
Yes, it has been way more since last year, because last year we had a really big emergency with the oil spill that happened with Boccaccio. I think it really woke up the minds of the Mauritian population towards environmental issues. We had our first ever movement protest for environment that happened last year. So I think more and more people are trying to think more towards environmental, good. So yes, I think it's growing more and more.
Good. Then Leon is asking what has to change that the youth will be taken more seriously, because at the moment it's not the case, but how can you actually influence these important decisions and meetings?
I think activism is the main way to do it. It is important to, for me personally, I think it is important for world leaders to see that behind the crisis, there are actually people. So to me, it is important to go to those events, to go to those protest movements, and to actually showcase that we as the youth, we're scared of what is going to happen in the future. So actually going to all those events, to me, is one of the best way we can show our participation and show our views.
Okay, and Paul is asking, how did you become a representative for your country?
So how can you become? So they are very active online. You can follow the social medias, you can get involved, and the more you get involved, the more you have the opportunity to see it. I would encourage anyone who wants to try and be a delegate to follow Conference of Youth on social medias, and anytime there is an opportunity, they will actually show it on their medias.
Yeah, good. Yeah, and then the question, how come the US can send 1,000 representatives and other countries can't? Well, you already mentioned a few reasons, right? So some are money and resource reasons, and others are really just the travel issues that we have due to the pandemic. I think, Shaudan also has some, can talk a bit about that as well. Is there any other reasons?
I think maybe like the travel destination overall. It's in Europe, so even for me, like I had the chance to go from Amsterdam, but if I had to go from Mauritius, it would be way more expensive for me, and it would take a longer time. So I think the conference being in Glasgow is really helpful for certain countries more than others. But yeah, and definitely COVID is a big thing also. So travel restrictions, vaccine issues, it is very huge.
Yeah, okay. So one last question. The biggest disappointments, very quick.
So I think my biggest disappointment is the phase out versus phase down. I think it happened completely at the end. I was following COP26, and I was actually pretty happy with the first decisions that were made. But when India decided to do, the phase down instead of phase out, I don't know, it just came back that they have a lot of power, and if they want to do it, they can do it like this. And yeah, for me, it was the biggest disappointment for sure.
Yeah, it was quite a turn at the end. Okay, then thank you very much, and I give the floor back to Philip.
Yeah, thank you also from my side. You have very interesting and of course very important, clear words that you gave us. Being disappointed, so at least for now the glass is definitely half empty. So let's see if we can fill it. And I think there were already a number of important points made that link very naturally and nicely to our next speaker. The question of why the US has been there with a large delegation, and many people might also be simply one of power politics, the USA being the most powerful country in the world, the second most powerful maybe being China. So I'm really interested in what the role of China was. And there were different reports. It was mentioned that the Chinese president didn't show up, but maybe that was a good or a bad thing. We don't really know, but we will hear an idea from Chaoran. Chaoran Li is also a PhD student at our university. Chaoran has a master in environmental policy from Renmin University, and she has been at the COP in Glasgow to do research. Actually, your research, Chaoran, is on the role of China in global and international climate politics. So I'm really interested to hear your view on the role of the large emitters, those countries that take a large share, either historically, but also currently. And I understand, Chaoran, that you will share some slides. So I'm excited to give you the floor.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction, Philip. And yeah, I'm really happy to get the chance to be at Glasgow. And yeah, you can see the picture I took when I was in the big line to enter the venue to give you an idea the accessibility for this COP. And yeah, today I want to address this COP26 from the perspective of the large emitter, which is based on my general observation when I attend the first week of COP26. I think, yeah, I think a lot of people are quite disappointed about the final result. But for me, I think what's more important is that to pay a closer look to at what's the actual overall approach those big emitters like US and China are adopt during this process, because that will determine what's the how constructive they are during this process, and what that will also reflect in the final outcome. So for me, if I answer the question raised by Philip, I would say I'm cautiously optimistic about this result, because I think a lot of points Philip already mentioned in the beginning. We have this stronger emphasis on 1.5, and we also have this more direct reference to net zero, and also by around the mid-century. And all this, and also a lot of people are disappointed by the watering down language about coal, but actually this is the first time that was being mentioned by the document. And I can expect that we can have more ambitious address, not just about coal, but also other fossil fuels in the later phase. So I think if you read the final outcome, you can see those big emitter actually are doing things, probably not enough, but I think I'm cautiously optimistic towards these things. Also, like not to mention the China-US joint Glasgow declaration that will show like the ambition for those two large emitter, despite difference and the conflicts, even in many aspects, they are willing to sit down to have this conversation, and also form this working group together to pave the way next year. So, and I want to pay a closer look at China, because that's my research topic basically. And I want to, because I think a lot of people notice this sort of conflicting picture between how the outside world view China and how China view itself. I think China always remain low profile during COP, not this COP, but also the previous COPs, and very clear on their goals, and place pragmatism above ideology. I think there are several reasons can explain this sort of strategy or behavior. I think the first is the different pathway China adopt when you compare with their Western counterparts, because for the Western countries, probably they're more intended to have this sort of like a goal towards 2030, 2050, and then come back home to doing their research to say, okay, if I want to achieve this goal by 2030, how am I going to do this? Make the action plan, make the roadmap. But for China, it's more like the way around. China would probably do more research back home, like different modeling, different scenario. So when they get a more concrete and feasible numbers or data, and then come back to the international stage to say, okay, that's our goals, like net zero 2060. I think that they're doing this for some obvious reason, because China is the largest emitter in the world. So everyone is watching China, and everyone wants to hold China accountable. So if you say something cannot be fulfilled, everyone will just, pointing finger. So I think that's also intertwined with some cultural factor that I think this quote I add here from the China Special Envoy of Climate Change Mr. Xie Zhenhua, I think that explained quite well. Like China will take the action and make the fulfillment 100%. So if the answer is not certain, probably China will not raise it that hairy in the international stage. I think there's also some practical reason back home, because I think probably a lot of people notice that there is a sort of like a going back to coal production just right before the Glasgow in China, but that's due to the electricity shortage happened in North China. I think some people read this message as a negative one, but for me, I feel like it's actually a positive signal, which means that this country so rely on coal or actually try to get away with coal. And the shortage, electricity shortage, happened to be the evidence that if you're moving so fast without like really detailed planning, that will cause huge disaster because a lot of people's livelihoods are relying on coal. I think that's also the situation with India. So yeah, I think I will just stop here because I think I already over time, but I will leave this here with this main takeaways, and I'm open to the question, and yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Xiaodan. Yes, no questions. Yeah, okay. So yeah, thank you very much for all the insights. Also interesting that you say, yeah, they stick to their promises. I think that's something that, well, we can't say of other parties participating in the conference. So we were talking about the question that we had from the presentation before, why the US had such a large delegation. Maybe you can also say a few words about that, and also how large was the delegation of the Chinese?
Yeah, I think for US, I think the party delegates are around 100 something, and for China it's 60. So, but when you compare the numbers, if it's the party delegates versus the general observer participation, I think that's actually not really bad number. And actually, I happen to have this slide. Sorry. And you can see if the darker color means more country delegates there. So actually, Brazil is who sent the most delegates to COP26 this year. And if you talk about the observer versus the country delegates, actually there's a 37% of observer are joining this year. So that's quite, I think it's a better number than I expected before, because indigenous people, youth, and other non-state actors are all fell into these categories. Yeah.
Yeah, good. Very nice. Yeah, so that was the next point I wanted to ask you about, what the inclusive and exclusiveness of the COP. So here we have a couple of numbers, and also the slide before was quite interesting, no? That we the countries, how much they were each sending to the COP.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, my personal general feeling is that I think it's an inclusive and exclusive COP. Just based on my personal experience, I think it's inclusive because a lot of people get to be there. But yeah, I think I have to admit that if you're coming from Global South, lacking of resources and money, it's really difficult for you to actually be there because of the visa and also the high price you have to pay during the role. But somehow it's also inclusive because this is the first online COP I think. So you can actually see how they are negotiate with each other during the final, like during the last minute. So somehow it's you can see how they negotiate with each other during the final times. So I think it's in both ways. But like for me, I'm as an observer, I'm also not allowed to get in the room, which I should be let in because of the pandemic restriction. Because they said like, okay, there are too many people in the room, so observers just out, and we leave room for only for the delegates and negotiators, which is super frustrated, I have to say. So yeah, I think it's in both ways.
Okay, and then the fact that the Chinese president didn't come to the COP, do you see that, is it disinterest or no lack of commitment, or how do you put that?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, because for me, I don't think that's a sort of a negative signal, because as I just mentioned, I think what's most important is that you see how those countries overall approach in the negotiation, in this process, and what's the final outcome out of it. But it's not just, it's not really matter if they're being there. If they being there is just sort of like a gesture. But I think the concrete results is what matters most, because if some countries say something like the developed country promised for the 100 billion climate finance, but they didn't deliver that. So no matter how ambitious you are, how passionate you making the speech, but we have to be more practical about the results. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And then one last quick point. So you said China arrives at the COP with a lot of research already done. How much room for negotiation is there still then? So what is the room to move in when they participate in negotiations?
Sorry, can you repeat a bit?
Yeah.
Again?
So you said that China comes to the COP prepared with clear goals. How much are they then able to move during the negotiations?
Yeah, I think that's a tricky question, because I feel like I also discussed this with different stakeholders when I'm doing the interview. They feel like the China delegates very clear on their goals and boundaries, so they are not very easy to be lobbied. So they come to COP with the sort of like certain goals, targets. So probably not that much rooms for you to actually, shake a little bit.
Okay. Well, then, thank you very much for those insights. And then I give the floor back to Philip again.
Thank you very much. Also, John, very interesting, this nuanced assessment that you gave. I think it's very interesting also to just see your snapshot pictures from the negotiation room that we can actually get an idea how it looks like in some of those venues. No daylights, all this electric light. They're sitting there the whole day. It's really a tough job, I would say, to be a negotiator. Having said that, just one short comment, because before I hand over to our last speaker, it was mentioned already, this shift from phasing out to phasing down, and the role that both India but also China played in that. And I read a comment from Jennifer Morgan, the head of Greenpeace, and she said, actually, it doesn't matter what they're written, it is the end of fossil fuel. So I think that's also where you can read that message. So maybe just to provide another pitch for the glass being half full. But not every word has been spoken on this matter, because we have a final speaker, Stu Motta. He is also a PhD student at the VU. Stu does research on hydropolitics, in particular in the Mekong region, and he has been working there for more than a decade before he came to Amsterdam to study more. And I'm really interested in his perspective, because Stu will talk about the role that water issues play in relation to climate change, but also he will share, if time allows, some reflections on the Article 6. That's the article that will allow international cooperation and emissions trading to reach the NDCs. So, and last but not least, Stu, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Philip. So I'll launch in to discuss some of the implications of the COP in relation to water governance. And when you talk about water, some people's original reaction would be, it has no place at the COP because this is a climate change negotiation. So why would this have anything to do with water? And unfortunately, the track record of COP does also come to this conclusion. This was the first time there was a water pavilion this year, and having any sort of dedicated space to focus on the implications for these global governance systems on water. And I think that is quite telling overall into how these things are approached. And there is really still a tremendous amount of sort of siloing and carbon accounting. So when these ideas are assessed, it's usually related to CO2 or CO2 equivalents, and this is the same when it comes to carbon credits or carbon offsets. So your forests and your dams and everything else needs to be reduced into a carbon emissions number that then can be sold, traded, speculated on. And I think this brings us to the CDM and kind of carries over nicely into 6.4. I think under the clean development mechanism under Kyoto, one of the most common projects and the largest scale projects were actually hydropower. And so hydropower projects got funded, primarily in the global south or annexed to locations. And we're talking over 1,000 projects, and many of these large scale. And so it was a little bit, when you actually look at the Kyoto outcomes, it's strange to not be talking about water as part of it, because you're talking about large scale infrastructure being constructed in some of the world's most populated and shared river basins. So most of these projects went into China and India and Brazil. And unsurprisingly, during the 6.4 negotiations, which I did manage to get into, both Brazil and India were quite concerned about what was going to happen to the CDM. And similar, I think I would echo what Xiaoran brought up. China wasn't super outspoken, but Brazil and India definitely were. And this kind of goes to Philip's first framing the question is sort of half empty, half full. Now, we got the Paris 6.4 rule book, which frankly was multiple years delayed. I think the 6.4, the general conclusion of the rule book and the issues around Article 6 will probably be looked at as the largest outcome of this COP. And I think we can chart that up as a success generally. And it was many years in the working, and it was a vast improvement from, let's say, Madrid. That being said, to get some of the countries on board, there were concessions made and loopholes were granted in how this is going to work. And one of them is that CDM projects after 2013 can still issue, reissue, count, re-register projects under Paris, what's going to happen most likely is you're going to have huge swaths of carbon credits from hydropower that has already been counted in the past, that has already caused all sorts of environmental and social implications on some of the world's most important river basins, now be recirculated into a Paris framework. And it's quite bizarre, especially if you think about 2013, 2014, that these can be counted towards Paris when Paris didn't even exist. Right, so you have some positives coming out of this in rulebook creation, but then you also have some loopholes left. And I think the other thing, just to reflect, because it hasn't come up too much yet, is just the quantity of financial actors that were at this COP and the amount of global finance that is going to be getting involved in these activities. And so on one side, that's great. We've been trying to drag these people into the conversation for a long time, and you're definitely going to need certain aspects of finance, but it kind of puts us in a position where the devil is in the details. So how is this finance going to work? Are these attempts to bring banking systems, financial institutions to carbon neutrality? Are those going to be allowed to be done so through offsets that have already been counted? And currently there isn't really a lot of, let's say, public-led policy on guiding these things. And at this point, we're sort of letting financial institutions say, no, we got this. We're going to evaluate this as part of our ESR. We're gonna figure these things out, and there isn't really enough maybe oversight into how these processes work, and we don't really have enough time to have another 10 years of learning from mistakes of what can happen and what can go wrong when we're playing around with carbon offsetting. So I would say overall, with CDM and water, it was nice to see water governance actually having a physical space at the COP. I hope that there is broader thinking about natural resource governance more generally beyond carbon, things like biodiversity and social justice, which was raised by speakers before. So there was some positives, but I do show some have some reservations and concerns about some of the loopholes left. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sue. So you end with the undecided way in the middle. So some successes, some shortcomings. Yeah, maybe about the financial sector and the new players in the field. Philip, maybe you have some comments on that, because I imagine you're the sort of expert on this.
I just want to say we have 2 minutes left, and before I try to do the impossible, summarize what has been said, which I can't do, I just want to say it was tremendously insightful for me. I read a lot in the last couple of weeks, but it was really great to hear actually from you and to get a feeling what went down. And I think we're not necessarily concluding on whether the glass is half full or half empty, but I just want to focus on the title of our talk today. Where do we go from here? So one thing is to assess what happened, and the other is to be aware that if we really want to address the climate change challenge, the breakdown of the climate system, in fact, and the possible breakdown of civilization as we know it, because nothing less is at stake, then we need to focus very, very quickly on where we go from here instead of dwelling in the past. Glasgow maybe has not been the solution, because yeah, I think that's actually a misunderstanding of what these meetings can do. But I think it has still delivered sufficiently for us not to lose hope. Indeed, I believe that there are a number of things like focus on 1.5 degrees, more attention to the NDCs next year, finance coming on board rapidly and strongly, the conclusion of the rule book, Article 6, but also really the quite constructive role of both the US and China, two of the major players in this field, that make me cautiously optimistic. And adding the perspective of youth unfortunately had to leave because he has another meeting. I think if we keep on pushing in our various roles and responsibilities, it is in no way too late to solve this problem. I cannot decide for you whether you think the glass is half full or half empty, but what I can say is fantastic that we had this opportunity to hear from our speakers. So give them a big applause. Also, thanks for my colleagues organizing this, and I hope we can welcome you soon again to another edition of our SDG Academy. Thanks so much and have a very, very nice rest of the day.